Welcome to today's webinar. It's recognising prior learning in apprenticeship delivery, the 5 steps towards best practice. This webinar will be hosted by Bryony, Kingsland, Senior Manager for Funding and Policy at Sitting Girls Group. Before I hand over to Bryony to get started, just to run through a few details, all attendees are in listen-only mode. However, if you do want to ask any questions, please do so using the chat function, which can be found in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We will take all questions at the end of the session, but as I say, please send them through at any point during the webinar. So now, over to Bryony to start the webinar.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being patient. We are having a few problems this morning with our system, so I really hope that first of all you can all hear me. If someone could just say in the chat box that you can actually hear us, that would be great, because then we know if one person can, at least someone else can. And secondly, again, sorry for the slight delay in starting because of those issues with our system. If there are any problems at all and people either can't hear us or you have any problems at all with technology, then what we might do is either rebook it, but we will definitely send out the recording to everybody. So without further ado, if we just go through to the next slide, please, Michelle, thank you. Right, okay, so why this webinar and why now? The first thing to raise is the fact that in early February, the Department for Education launched a tender. What they were looking for was an organisation that would look into research and investigate how prior learning was being managed by providers that are delivering apprenticeship standards and frameworks. And that a part of that was also looking at the value for money in terms of what providers were doing to reduce the level and duration, not the level, the duration and content of the apprenticeship to take prior learning into consideration. So the second part of that is that the ESFA funding rules state that where they find providers have not reduced content and duration of an apprenticeship because they haven't taken prior learning into consideration, they may take action and reclaim funding. Now, I know that with a few providers that has already happened. I have spoken to one provider who had 2 days' notice for an audit. The audit was for 100 of their apprentices, and at the end of that, they had quite a substantial sum of money taken back from them because they hadn't taken prior learning into consideration. So this is a key aspect at the moment of the ESFA's audit regime for funding. So it's worth everybody being aware of it. And making sure that you are assessing prior learning from the start of any apprenticeship. And that's what we're going to cover in the rest of today's webinar, looking at what you can do and what the rules and regulations are around prior learning that you need to be aware of. So we can just move to the next slide, please, Michelle. Thank you. So let's look at prior learning expectations from the ESFA. The first thing that they expect is that apprenticeship funding, whether that's levy or co-investment, is not used to pay for or accredit learners' existing knowledge, skills and behaviours. And this is where prior learning becomes incredibly important, because you as providers who are delivering apprenticeships must account for prior learning and reduce the duration, content and the price, where appropriate, and that's obviously a discussion with your employers, of any or each of the apprenticeships that you're delivering. The other rule inside the funding rules that the ESFA produced for apprenticeships is that where accounting for prior learning means that the programme duration will be less than the 12 months minimum for any apprenticeship, or would mean that you as a provider are unable to deliver the 20% off the job requirements to the individual apprentice, that apprentice is then ineligible to take that apprenticeship. So if their prior learning affects the duration, but also affects how much 20% off the job can be delivered, the apprentice is ineligible to take the apprenticeship, and I'll talk more about that later on in the webinar with some of the slides. So prior learning must be quantified, obviously initially assessed, quantified, evidence, and all of the evidence kept in the evidence pack and the written agreement with the employer. And it's really important for you as providers and employer providers as well, obviously, to keep yourself safe and to make sure that you do retain all your funding for the delivery of apprenticeships, that your evidence is robust, it's comprehensive, and it explains exactly what you've done and why you've done it. So we'll go into that in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please, Michelle. So what counts as prior learning? So as far as the ESFA is concerned, work experience relative to the apprenticeship standard or framework is also part of prior learning. Prior learning is not just about qualifications or previous apprenticeships that might have been taken by the individual. They also look at what current learning skills and knowledge and behaviours the individual has taken from their current job or their previous jobs, and whether that could contribute to the content of the apprenticeship. So this is particularly important when you've got a current employee. Having an initial assessment with that employee to find out how much they've actually learned from doing their job, how long they've been doing their job, how much they've learned from it, and what they've learned that actually would be replicated in the delivery of the apprenticeship is equally as important as any prior qualifications or apprenticeships that individual may have taken that could also contribute to the apprenticeship that they currently want to take or that their employer wants them to take. So work experience in their current or previous jobs, any prior educational qualifications in a related sector subject area, and any previous apprenticeship undertaken in a related sector subject area. What I would say about this is that it's important not to distinguish prior learning with the different levels. So if, for example, someone has taken an apprenticeship at level 2 in, let's say, beauty therapy or hairdressing, it does not mean that this disqualifies them for an apprenticeship at level 3 in beauty therapy or in hairdressing, because the different levels of qualification are different levels of knowledge, skills and behaviours that are required. So levels are not so important. We're talking about similar qualifications at the same level where content is exactly the same and replicated in the apprenticeship that your employer is asking you to deliver. Can we go to the next slide, please, Michelle? So let's look at some of the steps to support best practice for initial assessment. So the most important thing you can do as part of initial assessment is carry out a thorough initial assessment with the apprentice to establish their full learning and employment history and find out exactly what they've done before, at what level, and whether that might replicate some of the knowledge, skills and behaviours that they've got to learn from the apprenticeship that they're about to take. There are a variety of different ways that you can do that. So the best way to start is to use the standard or the assessment plan, or the standard and the assessment plan, or the framework as the basis for the discussion. In the standard and the assessment plan, it gives you all the information of what's got to be delivered as part of that apprenticeship, or as part, whether it's a framework or a standard, and what you've got to deliver in terms of knowledge, skills and behaviours to that apprentice to make sure that they are at the level and ready for gateway and endpoint assessment to become qualified. So using the standard and assessment plan or the framework as a basis for discussion is a good way to start. And then obviously having a thorough conversation with the individual apprentice about what knowledge, skills and behaviours the apprentice has already gained from previous or current employment, comparing that to the standard and assessment plan that you've both got a copy of, or the framework that you've got a copy of. And as I said before, particularly important with current employees. And I'll give you an example of this. We were recently talking to a provider that was working with an employer that wanted one of their managers to take a leadership and management apprenticeship. This individual had been a manager inside this particular company for a good couple of years. The problem that the employer felt was that although they were quite good at their job in terms of their own job, they were not a particularly great manager or leader. But they'd been doing that job for 2 or 3 years. And a lot of the knowledge that was within that particular leadership and management apprenticeship, the person in question already knew. The issue here, as far as the ESFA was concerned, because I did query with them about this to see what they would say about this sort of situation, was not that the individual did not have the knowledge, skills and behaviours inside their head as part of that apprenticeship. It was more a performance management issue. So the ESFA response to this query that I put in was, this is a performance management issue, and what the employer should be doing is looking at a performance management approach with this particular individual, or a series of smaller courses or programs that would enable them to become a better leader or a better manager, because they already had the knowledge. The problem was that they were just not applying it. So in those situations, it's not really appropriate for that individual to take that apprenticeship, because they already have a lot of the knowledge and skills and behaviours, certainly enough to take them below that 12-month minimum duration. And so if the ESFA had audited that, they would probably have clawed money back from the provider, because they hadn't taken into account the knowledge, skills and behaviour the individual already had. So they saw that as a performance management issue, or an issue which could be addressed by the employer running a series of short courses or giving some mentoring to the individual, not suitable for an apprenticeship. So as I said before, discuss what knowledge, skills and behaviours the apprentice has already gained, particularly important with current employees if they've been enrolled for a period of time. Look at the level that that individual is. Is this a progression for them? Because that is completely acceptable as part of an apprenticeship. How do their knowledge, skills and behaviours compare to the standard or framework content? The other part of the conversation to have is, what does the apprentice and the employer want to get out of the apprenticeship? And if you think about that early example I gave about improving the leadership skills of an individual, what is the employer goal and what's the apprenticeship goal? Where are they currently against that goal? And how much of the content is new to them, and therefore from a point of view of a goal in the future, is this going to give them progression? Is it going to give them significant new learning, significant new skills? Once you've had that conversation, you've agreed with both the employer and the individual that they are suitable for an apprenticeship because they are gaining significant new skills, knowledge, behaviours. You need to keep comprehensive evidence for that initial assessment and the conversation that you have with the individual in the evidence pack, and summarise it in the commitment statement so that both the employer and the apprentice and yourselves are completely in agreement about what is going to be delivered and you're committed to that. And if there is part of it that isn't going to be delivered because it's already known, then obviously the employer is committing to that as well. So we have the next slide, please, Michelle. Thank you. So the next step of the 5 steps is discuss that prior learning, the previous and current job roles of the apprentice and the employer. So once you've done the initial assessment, you then need to have the conversation with the employer about what that means in terms of delivery for you as the provider on the employer premises, or whether it's the off the job, and also what you might do in terms of reducing the content and duration, and therefore potentially the price, because the whole thing about prior learning is that the ESFA is looking at this from a value for money point of view. Are employers getting value for money for the learning that they're getting and the levy that they're paying? And is the ESFA and the government getting value for money out of the levy, which is frankly their money because it is a tax, from the point of view of how many and what is being delivered? So those discussions that you have with the employer and potentially with the apprentice as well, if relevant, is the competency at a lower level indicating that the apprentice is ready for progression. So if, for example, you've got someone who has just started as a manager, then a leadership and management apprenticeship would be absolutely fine because they have no competency at that lower level. They might have been doing a bit of supervision or mentoring, but they don't have the competency and the knowledge to really progress. So the apprenticeship is part of the progression for that particular apprentice. Is the employer ready for that, and are they aware of that? But also, is the content of the apprenticeship relevant for the job that they're going into? Is the job going to enable them to develop the competencies, develop the knowledge, develop the behaviours that will enable them to meet the gateway requirements and endpoint assessment requirements? Has the employer or have you assessed that there's a particular learning need? If so, what is it? Other conversations you can have it. Is the learning need identified by the employer relevant to the apprenticeship? So has the employer identified that they want to put this individual on an apprenticeship because there's a specific set of learning that they want the individual to have? Will the apprenticeship address that? Or actually, is it better addressed by a different type of learning? So it could be a set of courses, it could be an individual qualification rather than an apprenticeship, because an apprenticeship doesn't solve all the issues for the employer. It will do in a majority of cases, but it may not solve all of them. So it may well be that as you go through that conversation with the employer, you realise that in actual fact, this individual is not suitable for the apprenticeship. There's too much of the content that they already know. So is it relevant for potentially you to deliver another type of qualification to that individual? Can you use your adult education budget to deliver that a qualification to that individual? Or would they be feasible for an FE adult learner loan to take the qualification instead? Or is the employer prepared to pay for another type of qualification to get that learner, that individual where they need to be inside the employer's organisation, rather than an apprenticeship if the apprenticeship is not relevant, or the individual is ineligible because their current knowledge takes them below that 12-month duration. So there are other options there that you can discuss with the employer that could get that individual employee where the employer wants them to be if the apprentice is not suitable for the apprenticeship. So think about your adult education budget, think about adult learner loans. Are they a feasible option, or is the employer willing to pay for an individual qualification that might get that learner where the employer wants them to be? So you agree all of those relevant options, and the key milestones for the apprentice's learning programme including any reduction in content and duration. You agree that with the employer because they have to sign up to that, and there may be parts of that they're not particularly happy with. And ensure that no repeat, this is to ensure that no repeat learning occurs unless it's necessary to reach that gateway. So you then reduce the price and duration accordingly in agreement with the employer, and I'll talk about that in the next slide about ways that you can potentially do that. All of this needs to be evidenced and signed for by the employer, so it needs to be into the written agreement, but most importantly in the commitment statement, signed by the employer and signed by the apprentice to say that they do agree to those changes to the content of the programme. Next slide, please, Michelle. So, assessing prior learning and reducing duration. I've had some questions from this from a variety of providers at the annual apprenticeship conference last week, and they were asking me, how do you go about reducing the duration of an apprenticeship if there is prior learning? So there are various approaches that you can take to this. The first one is there a previous qualification? And if there is a previous qualification, have a look at the content of that qualification and assess how many guided learning hours were. Sorry, I've got a lot of stuff coming up on the screen all of a sudden that's interrupting with what I can see. Thanks, Michelle. So take a look at that previous qualification that the apprentice-to-be has taken. Look at what guided learning hours inside that qualification were committed to the knowledge and skills that the apprentice already has. So if, for example, you had a hairdressing qualification, so I'm using hair and beauty a lot today, aren't I? So if you had a previous qualification in hair and beauty, and 30 or 40 hours of that were committed to hair washing, for example, and they wanted to do an apprenticeship at level 3, but they'd already got that part of that from a previous qualification. You would look at how many guided learning hours were dedicated to that aspect of the qualification. You would then reduce the duration of the apprenticeship accordingly. So if it was 40 hours and the apprentice is doing, say, I don't know, 10 weeks and 10 hours a week on that aspect of the apprenticeship, then you would reduce the apprenticeship by 4 or 5 weeks, by a month or so. So that's one way of doing it if there are previous qualification, is use the guided learning hours to support your qualification, to support your content duration reduction. Make sure that you evidence that so it's very clear to both Ofsted and also to the ESFA why you've done it and how you've done it. The next point is if they've got a previous apprenticeship, how much time was spent on the relevant knowledge, skills and behaviours in the previous apprenticeship that would replicate what's in the apprenticeship that they're about to start, and then calculate that in terms of how much time you would spend on that knowledge, skills and behaviours with an individual apprentice. So what level was the apprenticeship, what sector, how long was it, check the contents against the new apprenticeship, what is the same, and then take that out, and that should give you an approximate idea of how much duration, how much you need to reduce the duration in the apprenticeship they're about to take. The third one is obviously the previous work experience. That's a conversation with the apprentice and the employer. How long did it take the apprentice to become proficient in the particular skill or the knowledge or the behaviours required in that particular job? Was any in-house training given? How long was that in-house training? And how much was given? Are there any gaps in the knowledge that needs to be addressed, in which case you would then up the duration or potentially lower it if there were no gaps? Would a qualification or another type of training be more appropriate in an apprenticeship if it takes the duration of your apprenticeship below that 12 months, as I mentioned earlier? So do have a conversation with the employer and the apprentice about their previous work experience, not just in their current employment, but in previous employment. How long did it take them to become proficient in the knowledge, skills and behaviours that might be replicated in the apprenticeship they're about to take? Assess that in terms of the amount of hours it would have taken that might be delivered in a week or that might have been learnt in a week by the individual apprentice, and then you can reduce your apprenticeship in terms of weeks once you've applied those hours that would have been delivered during the course of a week for the individual. I hope that makes sense, but please feel free to ask any questions if it doesn't. So if we go back to the steps on the next slide, please, Michelle, thank you. Sorry, everybody, I know I'm having to ask someone else to move my slides on, but we're all in different parts of the country running this webinar. So I've got Michelle in another part of the country and my colleague Tacey Ryby in a different part of the country, and me in our head office in London. So this is step 3, review progress of the apprentice regularly. Now this is really important in terms of progression. You may reduce the content from the point of view of the KSB, the knowledge, skills and behaviours of a particular individual, but having a regular review to make sure that your individual apprentice is progressing against the goals and the milestones that you've set, and making sure that the programme is still appropriate for that particular individual, particularly if you've reduced content, and having conversations about how the apprentice is finding the progression or finding the learning in terms of distance travelled. You can pick up during those reviews that actually some of the content and knowledge that you might have reduced might need to be put back in if the apprentice's knowledge is not as comprehensive as assessed at the beginning. A thorough initial assessment should assess that, but you are talking to an individual learner, and in some cases they may assess their own knowledge and skills as being better than potentially might be needed in the apprenticeship that they're about to take. So do make sure that you regularly review to make sure that distance travel and progression against the goals and milestones you've set with the individual and with the employer are still appropriate for the programme and for the individual. And does the learning programme that's currently in place reflect the knowledge and skills and behaviours of the apprentice, and are they still learning, and are they still taking on new knowledge, and it's significant new knowledge? And is the reduction in duration of content, is it fit for purpose, or actually have you reduced it too much, and that's affecting progression and the planned end date for learning? If so, why is that occurring, and what might you need to put back into that programme, and might that result in you actually increasing the duration by a week or two, in which case obviously you've got an ILR change to make. So finally there as well, from the point of view of reviews, how do you assess the job role against a standard or framework to ensure there's enough opportunity for the apprentice to progress and consolidate their knowledge gained as part of the programme? That needs to be checked as part of reviews right the way throughout the duration of the apprenticeship. And those reviews are a really good opportunity to make sure that you are meeting the Ofsted requirements from the point of view of distance travel and progression, because they will look at that during inspection. So the reviews, really important aspects of the five steps towards best practice in prior learning. If we have the next slide, please, Michelle, thank you. So, evidence. Check your learner record service for previous qualifications. That's really important. Learners don't always remember, as we know, that they may have taken a previous qualification that may be relevant to an apprenticeship. I've already come up against that with a particular provider who said the learner told me they haven't taken any serious qualifications. Then we checked the learner record service and found they'd taken 2, one of which was very relevant to the apprenticeship they wanted to take. So do check the learner record service. Obviously, that's only going to be applicable for learners below the age of around about 30, because the learner record service only came into play in about 2006, 2007. So if your learner is older, it's best to go on their own knowledge of their apprenticeships, copies of their previous certificates if they've got them, and having that really thorough conversation at the beginning. But do check the LRS, the Learner Record Service for previous qualifications. Collect and retain all the evidence for relevant prior learning. So that's any Learner Record Service information you have, copies of previous certificates, copies of the job specification for the individual in their current job role is a really good piece of evidence to collect as well. Make sure that you've retained that in the evidence pack for the individual so that it supports your reduction in duration and content, but also supports from a point of view if Ofsted come in and they say, why have you reduced the duration of content? You'll be able to show that evidence to Ofsted as well. Make sure you include the signatures of the apprentice and the employer for any changes to content and duration as part of the evidence pack, because then you've got their agreement and that keeps you safe. So you just haven't arbitrarily reduced content and duration because you think it's applicable, but you've got the agreement of both the apprentice and the employer for that reduction in content and duration. And ensure that, as I said earlier, the commitment statement reflects those changes to content and duration and also has the signature of both the apprentice and the employer for those changes. Good idea to ensure that your written agreement with the employer, your contract with the employer, reflects changes to price and duration, particularly price, but also duration, and ensure any adjustments that you might have to make to the apprentices or employers to the apprentice programme have the employer and the apprentice's signatures where relevant. So if, for example, you were part of a review, you were holding a review with the apprentice, and you decided during that review and the conversation with the apprentice that actually you probably needed to increase the duration for another couple of weeks because the assessment at the beginning missed something, it does happen, then you would obviously need to make an adjustment and have the employer's signature and the apprentice's signature, and you may also need to talk to the employer about a slight change in price as well. It's best to have all of that agreed at the beginning as part of that commitment statement and the written agreement with the employer, so that they are prepared for absolutely anything, including an increase in duration if it's needed, if you're finding that progression and of the apprentice is slow because there's actually content that should have been covered that you've reduced because they said they knew it or thought that they already understood it and knew it. So I know that's complex and it's a difficult thing to manage, but it does keep you safe and ensure that you don't get funding clawed back during the funding audit. Next step, please, Michelle, thank you. So final steps. Now this is really important as well. Endpoint assessment. One of the things that you should be doing is checking with your endpoint assessment with the gateway and evidence requirements. If you produce content and duration of apprenticeship, does it mean that you've got missing evidence or information that you would need to give your endpoint assessment organisation that would actually have an effect at the point of gateway and the preparation for endpoint assessment for the individual learner? So liaise with the endpoint assessment organisation to ensure that any changes to the on-programme content that you're making because of prior learning don't affect the assessment plan requirements. Check the assessment plan as well as part of that apprenticeship standard. Obviously, if it's a framework, it's not relevant, so this is really just for standards, but as we know, next year in 2020, apparently, the government is going to remove all the frameworks and everything will be in standards, so this becomes particularly applicable. So do the changes to content and duration require you to provide any other information to your endpoint assessment organisation as a replacement for what you would normally give at Gateway? And the final thing is, are the apprentice and the employer fully aware of the assessment plan and the endpoint assessment requirements? And are you and they confident that the assessment plan requirements can still be met if content and duration are reduced? Having that conversation at the beginning, having a conversation with the endpoint assessment organisation, making sure everybody is clear and ready, make sure that there are no issues or blips later on in the apprenticeship at Gateway when you're readying your apprentice to get ready for assessment. So those are the 5 steps to support best practice on endpoint assessment that you need to be aware of. On prior learning that you need to be aware of. I'm sure there are lots of other ones, but those are the main ones that we think will ensure that you will, or I think that you will ensure that you will be safe during an ESFA funding audit. So next slide, please, Michelle. One more thing to think about, Ofsted and prior learning. Ofsted inspections consider the distance travelled by the apprentice when they look at the value added during the training programme, and that includes apprenticeship standards and frameworks. So when looking at prior learning, there's a twofold process there to really be considered. First of all, Ofsted include that distance travelled. So they will also look at, to a certain extent, where did the apprentice start and where did they end up as part of their programme. And if there's 2 things here, if they feel that prior learning has not been considered and obviously you're repeating learning that doesn't need to occur, that will result in poorer grading during inspections. But at the same time, if you have assessed prior learning but you've missed out learning that should have occurred and the distance travelled and the progression of that learner is slowed because of that, they will also take that into consideration. So that's where that initial assessment, initial conversation with the learner and the employer become really important to make sure that distance travelled, progression for the apprentice is occurring within the timeline that you've assessed it should do and the Ofsted think it should do. So they will look at your evidence of the robust initial assessment and look for the clear milestones and progress that you've set against that apprenticeship standard or framework with the individual and the employer. And that's essential for a good inspection outcome. So make sure that you have set clear milestones and that you are tracking and reviewing the progress against those milestones with the individual apprentice, because that's going to be essential for a good inspection outcome. And that's also part of that whole prior learning approach as well to be aware of. Next slide, please, Michelle. And that's it, everybody. So I hope that was helpful. I'm sure you've probably got some questions now, which I can't see that well. Michelle, could you read out the questions for me, because I don't have access to them at this end. It would be really great if you could take a pick and choose, and I'll answer as many as I possibly can. I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions for this, because I know that prior learning is. Hello, Michelle, can you still hear me? Hopefully everyone can still hear us. Hi everybody, sorry, I think we may have a technological blip. It seems to have gone very still on my screen, and I think I may have actually lost my support team. Oh, hello, we're back again. Sorry about this, everybody. And I can't do anything about this at this end because I don't have control of the webinar. Michelle has control.
Hi, Bryony, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you, Michelle. Hopefully that means everybody else can as well.
Yeah, sorry about that. Just some technical issues there with the system. Do apologise. Yeah, we have had some questions come through, so I will just run through those now.
Great.
Sorry about that. First question, can part of the 20% be delivered by the employer?
The off the job?
Yeah.
I think that is the off the job. Yes, I mean, part of the 20% can be delivered by the employer if it's relevant. As we know, it's more than likely that as the apprenticeship, within the apprenticeship, the employer is delivering some aspects of that, and that can vary depending on the type of apprenticeship it is, and the type of delivery you've agreed with the employer. So yes, the thing there with the employer obviously delivering 20% off the job is you need to be able to track that and evidence it in a way that you're happy with, that keeps you safe as a provider. Obviously that's separate if it's an employer provider. So make sure you've agreed with the employer and with at the beginning, if they are going to deliver some of that off the job, what it is they're going to deliver, how are they going to deliver it, and that they can give you evidence which is acceptable in terms of audit for the ESFA, that proves that training is delivered whilst the apprentice is off the job, i.e. not at their workspace or at their desk. But yes, there's no reason why the employer shouldn't deliver some of that 20% off the job if that's the arrangement you've made. And in some cases, for instance, in the care sector, I know that there are employers that are delivering the more clinical aspects of an apprenticeship, and a lot of that is taking place off the job. So yes, that's entirely feasible to happen. Just make sure you're safe and you can collect the evidence, and that it's evidence that will be acceptable to the ESFA.
Okay, great, thank you. So, for a degree apprenticeship, is prior learning only considered at level 3, as the degree should step people up through level 4, 5 and 6?
Sorry, Michelle, can you say that again? I lost you there for a minute. In a degree apprenticeship,
is prior learning only considered at level 3, as the degree should step people up through level 4, level 5 and level 6?
Oh no, prior learning applies to any apprenticeship. So if it was a degree apprenticeship, for example, and your learner had already taken another degree at a similar level, you would have to, if it was in a completely different sector, there's probably no worry. But if they are taking a degree, we have got some apprentices that are taking degree apprenticeships that have already taken one degree. You need to consider the previous degree, what learning inside that degree might be applicable to the new degree apprenticeship, and then reduce the content and duration of that apprenticeship, degree apprenticeship accordingly. It's not, obviously from a level point of view, what you're looking at is prior learning that's at the same level as the apprenticeship the individual is about to start. So if you've got someone who's taking a degree apprenticeship, it's if they've taken another degree. If you've got someone who's taken a qualification at level 4 and they're about to take a level 4 apprenticeship standard or framework, that's when you need to start thinking about prior learning and anything they might have done in the previous qualification or apprenticeship that might replicate what you're about to deliver in the new apprenticeship. Where if it's a lower level, then you've got a lower level of skills, because the levels of different qualifications and apprenticeships are quite different. And from a pedagogical point of view, that's been very carefully laid out in the setup of individual qualifications at individual levels. So that's what you would call progression. It's not replicating learning, it would be learning at a different level.
Okay. How does RPL get evidenced in the portfolio for EPAO?
How does prior learning get evidenced in a portfolio for well, it would be everything that I've just gone through in the 5 steps. So you would have, the best thing to do, as I said before, is have a conversation with your endpoint assessment organisation, see what they would accept. All of the endpoint assessment organisations are aware of this prior learning issue. They will be ready to tell you what they feel is acceptable in terms of replacing any portfolio evidence, whether it's a copy of the certificate, whether it's something from the Learner Record Service, or whether it's a written and signed statement from the employer and the individual in terms of what they already know because they're in their current role and have been in it for a couple of years. But the apprentice is either giving the progression or it's actually new learning and moving into a slightly different role. Talk to the endpoint assessment organisation and see what they will accept. It will probably slightly differ, but also look at what's in the assessment plan and what's required, and what can you provide from the evidence you've put into your evidence pack to evidence your reduction in content and duration of the apprenticeship. What evidence have you got from the apprentice in terms of either certificates that you could give to the EPO to say, this is the reason we reduced it, this is the reason it's not covered in the portfolio, it's been covered in another qualification, here's a copy of the certificate, here's a copy of the qualification if you've got it, or access to a link to the qualification which shows they've already learned this. So all of those points that I covered in the 5 steps.
Okay. Someone said here, this is a fairly new policy. What's the expected date that new starts will come into this?
Well, actually, it's not really a new policy. It has stated in the funding rules from the beginning that the ESFA funding rules for apprenticeships, that they do not expect learning to be replicated, and that apprenticeship is about new skills, new knowledge, new behaviours. So it's not really new. The issue is that the ESFA have picked up in the last 6 to 9 months that a lot of providers have not been assessing prior learning either at all or effectively, but are charging full price for delivering apprenticeship, which is replicating or repeating learning the individual already has. They've picked up that this is a real issue, which is why they went out to tender for an organisation to research and investigate this in terms of audit, because it's not a practice they want to see continuing, but it's not a new policy, I'm afraid. It's always been there. It's just that the ESFA is now concentrating on it, so it should always have been happening. If you've got apprentices that are coming to an end, then obviously it's a bit past the point. But if you've got apprentices that have started in the last 3 to 6 months, it is very much worth your having a quick check to make sure that you have assessed prior learning effectively with all of those apprentices, because they will potentially be picked up during an audit.
Thank you. So another one, what is classed as regular when it comes to reviews, and should these reviews be with both employer and training provider, or can these be delegate to employer only?
No, every single apprentice and provider should be carrying out reviews. I think generally the best practice is every sort of 8 to 12 weeks you should be reviewing progress and milestones and distance travelled with the individual apprentice, and that's a provider responsibility. Hopefully your employer is involved in that, because it depends obviously how much you're delivering the apprenticeship. If the employer is delivering some of that apprenticeship, then they should really be involved as well. So either the mentor or the manager of the individual should be there, or could be there. But best practice, and Ofsted will expect to see this as well, is that you review the progress and the milestones of your individual apprentice every 8 to 12 weeks, and that should be in the evidence pack as part of that apprenticeship progress reporting. And Ofsted will expect to see that for every individual apprentice. So yeah, 8 to 12 weeks. We used to do it in the when I was a director of a business college. I think we used to do it probably once every 10 to 12 weeks.
Right. If someone has studied in a different country, does this still apply the same? For example, an enrolled nurse in Australia applying for a nursing associate programme in the UK?
Yes, it does. And there is actually a whole section of that, or there's a section of that in the funding rules to do with looking at foreign qualifications or foreign courses or programs that have been taken that might be relevant to a new apprenticeship. It's not something I decided to cover in this particular webinar, having asked the, but it's typical, isn't it? We decided not to cover it and someone asked the question. Yes, there is a process for that. I'm trying to think the best way to do it, because I'm not that au fait with it myself, I must admit, having never done it myself. But there is a process for it that's flagged in the funding rules, and there is a body that you can contact that confirms particular certificates and also the level of certificates. I think what I'll do is I'll actually answer that and put the information for it in the Q&A that we'll provide as part of this webinar. So I'll dig that, I'll research that, dig it out, and I'll put it in the Q&A when we send that round in the next 48 hours. And you'll get access to the Q&A. The answer and the link for that will be in the Q&A. So I'm sorry I didn't cover it in the webinar. Obviously, I should have done.
Okay, thank you. So if the apprentice didn't need to attend one module, but that module is in the middle of delivery, how do we reduce duration as they would still attend the following modules, which would result in the same end date?
I'm not sure I understand that question. I mean, if there is a module that they don't attend, then you would reduce the content and duration of the apprenticeship accordingly. So if there was a module which was 10 hours, which they didn't need to attend because they'd already covered it in a previous qualification or they already had that knowledge, then they wouldn't attend that. And you would reduce, if they were doing, I don't know, 5 hours a week learning for the apprenticeship, you'd reduce the duration of the apprenticeship by 2 weeks. So I'll have a look at that one more closely as part of the Q&A. So 10 more module, but that module is in the middle of delivery. How do we reduce duration as they would still attend the following modules? Well, yeah, they might do the following modules, but you reduce it by the number of hours or time that module you would take. I hope that explains it. So no, it wouldn't result in the same end date because they wouldn't do that module. So as I said, if the module was 10 hours long and they were doing, I don't know, 2 hours a week learning with you or 5 hours a week learning with you, so if it was 5 hours a week, you reduce the duration by 2 weeks. If it was 2 hours a week, you reduce it by 5 weeks. It depends how you're delivering that module as to how much you would reduce. But no, you would still have to reduce the duration. You could not deliver something and still keep the full duration of the apprenticeship. That wouldn't be value for money as far as the ESFA is concerned, and they would potentially take back funding from you for that. So you'd also have to reduce the price for the employer as well.
Okay. Ratio of face-to-face and remote reviews, what is the preferred?
Well, the thing is, with reviews, there are various ways you can do it. I mean, you know, we've got providers that carry out reviews via Skype, or they carry out reviews on the phone with the employer and the apprentice, or just the apprentice on the other end of the phone. If they do it face-to-face, it depends. It's totally up to you how you arrange that. But and with technology we have nowadays, there are lots of different ways that you can actually do that. I mean, sometimes providers are delivering on site and they carry out delivery on site, but they also carry out reviews whilst they're on site as well. But it may well be that that's not feasible. You need to do it by Skype, or you need to do it by telephone, or whatever sort of other technology that you're using to stay in contact with your individual apprentices. It doesn't have to be face-to-face, but carrying out a review at set points and making sure that you are checking those milestones and checking that progression with the apprentice. And then when you next see them, getting them to sign that review to make sure that it's actually happened, that's really important. I mean, there are various platforms and packages that enable you to do this. We have one. We have a learning assistant and smart screen that support providers and learners with reviews and with progression. You may be using other platforms, but there are platforms out there. But it doesn't have to take place face-to-face. It can be Skype, it can be by telephone, or any other technology that you wish to use. Just make sure that you've logged it, you've got the evidence that review has taken place. At some point, the apprentice has signed it to say that review has taken place and they're happy with what's been reviewed and the next set of milestones they've got to meet.
Okay. The job spec is a good document, and I do see the value in including this. But is there any allowance made in the consideration of the broad general nature of these and how these relate to the duration in role, or will they be taken at face value?
No, I mean, I think I really hope, I really hope that the auditors that come out and have those conversations with you, I mean, if you've got a job spec, the thing to do, because job specs do vary, and we know that some job specs are really great and some job specs are not so good. So the reality is that from a point of view of a job spec, if it's a really good one that gives you a really thorough rundown of what the actual task and role is of that particular individual, then you can use that, and you could even highlight the areas that are relevant to the apprenticeship and highlight why you've reduced there. But it will depend very much on the job specification, and I think that's down to your expertise as providers. Does the job spec show what it is that the apprentice, why it is that you are reducing the content and duration of the apprenticeship? If it doesn't, then it's no use as evidence, and then you've really got to look at a written statement by either the apprentice or by the employer, or probably by both in actual fact, to keep you safe. But the job spec is only useful if it's a thorough job spec and actually gives evidence to show why you're reducing the content and duration of the apprenticeship, because you can see they've been doing that job for 2 years, and the job spec says they do this, and that's actually what's required in the apprenticeship. So yes, you use your own judgment, use your expertise to decide whether the job specification is good enough to enable you to use it as evidence.
Okay. So I am having some technical issues bringing some of the questions through, Bryony, so it may be that we need to just add those to a frequently asked questions document, if you're happy with that, and get that sent out to people.
I'm happy with that. I'm sure that we've probably got colleagues on the webinar that would prefer for me to answer the questions now if possible, but if we can't access them,
I'm just trying to call
everybody. We have had some real serious technical issues with our internal communication system, Skype, in the last 2 days, and our IT team are trying to solve it, and I was really hoping it would be solved this morning, but I know that it's still obviously a problem. So I will make sure that I get the Q&A done over the course of the next day or so, and that we get it out to you by the middle or end of this week at latest. And any questions that we haven't answered today on the webinar, I will answer them fully and comprehensively as part of that Q&A, and it will be sent to everybody that's signed on for the webinar, that's either attended today or that couldn't actually make it, that actually signed up for the webinar. So apologies for that, and thank you, everybody.
Okay, thanks, Bryony.
Thank you.
Right.